Okay, I think we'll get going. As I said, we have around a 40-minute presentation followed by lots of Q&A. Well, hopefully Q&A. Feel free to type your questions in the chat as the talk is going. It's my pleasure to welcome Peter Constable from Microsoft. He's Senior Program Manager for Typography and Globalization Standards there. And he's been there for several years. I'd forgotten when he first joined. I'm sorry. Peter, maybe you can chip in. When did you first join?
2003.
2003. Oh, a long time. Before that, he was at SIL, where he was also engaged in linguistic and encoding matters, helping rare languages and that sort of thing. In 2016, he was one of the key people to lead the cross-industry initiative to develop the variable font extensions to the OpenType standard. And his main responsibility now is looking after that OpenType specification for Microsoft and the rest of us, and checking it's a good document and helping it become a better document and include lots of cool new features in the future, we hope. With that, I'll hand over to you, Peter. So I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, great. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. You can see that now, I think.
Yep. Great. It's great. All go, and we'll turn off our mics and give the floor to you.
Great. Thank you, Lawrence and Ksenia and Sai. It's always good to be back at another ATypI event. ATypI is particularly relevant for my topic today on the 5th anniversary of variable fonts, because it was 5 years ago at the ATypI conference in Warsaw when we first announced variable fonts to the world. I think we'll continue to look back at that event as a significant milestone in the evolution of digital typography. And here we are at the 5-year mark. It seemed to me like a good point in time to step back and reflect on where we are now. What's the status of things, and where have we gotten to over these 5 years? Have we started to realize some of the vision we had for what benefits might come from variable fonts? As I prepared for this talk, there were a number of people that I talked to get their perspectives. There were more that I would have liked to talk to. If there are people here who have perspectives they'd like to share, I'd be more than happy to get together with you in the coming weeks to hear more perspectives that people have. As I talked with these folk, there were a set of questions that I used to frame the discussion. So in the course of this presentation, I'll share some of their perspectives on some of these questions. First, though, I want to take a look at some timeline, and I'm going to actually go back about 25 years. In 1997, that was the emergence of web fonts with the introduction of the @font face rule in CSS2. Now, of course, web fonts didn't take off at that time, and I think a significant factor in that was that there wasn't consensus across industry on a single distribution format for font data on the web. That was really a blocker at the time. In the 90s, there were some other things going on with type. In particular, there were 2 different formats that had been introduced for variable fonts: Apple's TreeType GX and Adobe's multiple masters. But neither of those were being embraced. And in fact, Adobe pulled the plug on multiple master support in 2004. Stepping ahead to 2010, there were a couple of significant developments, one of which was the introduction of WAF. There was finally consensus on a distribution format for web fonts. It took over 10 years, but this finally opened the way for progress to start happening towards widespread adoption of web fonts. Another thing that happened around that time was thinking that was emerging around the need for responsive design, particularly motivated by people viewing web content on different kinds of devices and mobile devices. I think this combination of web fonts and responsive design contributed to people starting to revisit variable fonts. In 2013, Adam Twardock raised this question in the web font working group. whether multiple master fonts should be resurrected for the web. In 2015, Nick Sherman posted an article on A List Apart in which he was suggesting that variable fonts could provide advantages for responsive design. So this thinking, maybe we should revisit variable fonts. And that's exactly what we did. In March of 2016, we had our first meeting with people from various companies coming together to work out what were the extensions that we would need in OpenType to enable support for variable fonts. And then it was 6 months to the day that we made the announcement at ATypI in Warsaw and published OpenType 1.8 that had the extensions needed for variable fonts. And from that point, there were several things that started happening in fairly rapid succession. So within a month, we saw 3 different fonts come out, new variable fonts that were released. We also saw Lawrence Penny launched his Axis Praxis site that many have used for being able to explore what are variable fonts and what they can do. Around the end of the year, early in 2017, David Burlow released 2 variable fonts, Amsovar and Decovar, that I think were particularly significant because each explored in a different way what were some of the boundaries of variable font technology? What were some of the things that might be possible with it? Through the fall of 2016, the CSS working group had started working out what were extensions in CSS that would be needed to support variable fonts. And by the middle of 2017, a working draft for CSS fonts level 4 was published that included font variation settings and other extensions for variable fonts. And through this time, more people were coming out with more variable fonts. At the ATypI conference in Montreal, Adobe announced the next versions of Illustrator and Photoshop having support for variable fonts, as well as 3 new variable fonts, Acumen, Minion, and Myriad as variable fonts. It's the same time when Microsoft released an update of Windows 10 that added support for variable fonts, along with the Bondschrift font. And in the coming months, there were several other developments that happened. Support in browsers, Nick Sherman's variable font site, the concept of HOI, another exploration from underwear into the boundaries of what variable font technology might make possible. And of course, more and more variable fonts that were appearing. When we started working on variable fonts, we knew that there would be some creative font designs, although it wasn't necessarily anticipating that would be a primary use case. But we had seen in the past from the TrueType GX days, there had been fonts like Zycon and Buffalo Gals. And so we knew we'd see more things like that. And I mentioned the Decovar font that David Burlow released in the beginning of 2017. So Decovar has got 14 axes that each can be used to manipulate the stems in different ways and with different combinations create some very, very distinct personalities in this display face. In the middle of 2017, Lawrence Penny came out with a variable font that provided this animation. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, this is kind of an exceptional thing. But I think this was an indication of ongoing creative thinking about things that variable fonts might make possible that weren't possible before. I don't know if David Burlow had anticipated anybody doing animation with the Decovar font, but that didn't stop other people from thinking that, including people outside of the type industry. So one of those is Mandy Michael. She's a web developer and she gives talks at conferences on CSS and was doing things with CSS text effects and looking for new ideas of things that she could do with text effects. And she was particularly inspired by variable fonts and the Decovar font in particular. So came up with these animations early in 2018. She told me she particularly liked the hello example because of the way the CSS text effects were animated along with the font itself. So there were a number of other variable fonts that came out in subsequent years that were doing creative things as well. And I'll cite one more example in particular, which is the Tilt collection by Andy Clymer from, I think, about a year ago. So 3 different fonts, Neon Prism and Warp. And if you look at these in a 2D perspective, you may or may not think they're particularly interesting, but once you animate them, you get the impression that maybe these were particularly designed to evoke a sense of 3-dimensional depth. And so it's not surprising to go on and see things like this. You can imagine this being used in a virtual reality environment to create a realistic impression of neon signage. Again, others outside the type industry were starting to do things, and I'll mention ColdType. ColdType is a Python library that can be used to animate variable fonts in creating motion graphics. This was developed by Rob Stinson from Goodhertz. Now, Goodhertz is a company that makes audio software. So I was curious, what's the connection between audio software and animated text in motion graphics? What Rob explained to me was that he was captivated by the continuous nature of variable fonts and the fluidity that could be brought out in animating them, which to him really tied together with audio and music. And so Goodhertz created the ColdType library that they've used to create motion graphics that they incorporate into some of their the UI of some of their audio products. I'll give one more example of something that Rob Stinson put together. WorkMagic is actually a company that makes business software. I have no idea if this motion graphic is relevant in any way to what their business is all about, but I think it's really evocative of things that can be done combining type with motion graphics. And this was something that several of the people that I talked to called out. I think we're seeing an emergence as a result of variable fonts, combining typography and motion graphics to create a new genre of motion graphics we could call motion typography. But again, this wasn't one of the main use cases that we originally envisioned in 2016, but I think it's a welcome development. So what were some of the things that we talked about in 2016? We said that font variations will be integrated in OpenType, in particular, that OpenType Layout can be used together seamlessly with variable fonts. We said variable fonts would be efficient, and size savings is obviously a significant part of that. We mentioned that there would be familiarity for type designers that were already using workflows that used interpolation in their design process. And we said it would be promising, creating new opportunities for better typography and text layout for things like responsive design. We also called out this question. We knew that there would be skeptics, particularly knowing that variable fonts, 2 different variable font technologies had been introduced in the 90s, but had not succeeded then. And we knew people would wonder, if it failed then, could we expect anything but failure now? And so we talked about things that we thought were differences, things that were obstacles in the 1990s that we thought were significantly different in the 2016 climate. 2 of these in particular, one was the state of font tools. In the 1990s, there were no tools available for creating TrueType GX or multiple master fonts outside of Apple and Adobe. And that was obviously a big barrier for other type designers. And then these were competing formats. There wasn't convergence cross-industry on a single format for variable fonts. And that meant nobody was sure what they should invest in. There was no support in applications and operating systems. So these were things that we saw as being significantly different in 2016. Here we had major vendors saying together, we're agreeing on a single format that we're going to support, and there's going to be tools that can be used for creating these fonts. Okay, so that was 2016. Here we come 5 years later. And so asking people, have variable fonts been a success? And the responses I got from everybody was that, yes, they've been a success, but everybody said it was qualified. It's a limited success. It doesn't feel like it's fully landed yet. There were various reasons that we'll explore. But first, when I asked, okay, in what ways can you say that it has been a success? And there were a number of things that people called out. For example, the fact that variable fonts have now been adopted in operating systems for their system fonts. Windows 11, for example, now has a variable version of Segoe UI. The experimentation, the number of fonts being produced, these were all indicators of success. I was hopeful that there'd be a renewed interest in optical size, something that in the past had been a mainstay in mechanical type, but had declined in the 20th century with the emergence of scalable type. But I think today we can say that we're seeing renewed interest in optical size. Another thing that several people called out was just the number of variable fonts in Google Fonts. Over 200 of their families now are implemented as variable fonts. That's 16% of the families in Google Fonts, which I think is pretty significant. And that may be a contributing factor to this next thing that I'll call out, which is just adoption on the web. Some of it may be seamless as opposed to conscious choices of web designers. But the Web Almanac report for 2020 cited data showing that across the web, 11% of all pages are getting served up as variable fonts, an increase from 1.8% in the previous year. So that's approaching an order of magnitude increase in 1 year. I think that's extremely significant. Frank Griesheimer also mentioned that design students at the Royal Academy in The Hague have a strong interest in variable fonts. This is not just the type design students, but all the graphic design students wanting to use variable fonts in their projects. And of course, I've already mentioned the emergence of motion typography, which wasn't possible without variable fonts. So there have been several ways in which people could say, yes, there's been some successes, and ways in which expectations were exceeded. But then it was a limited success. And of course, things that we can't say yet have been successful. Aside from the size benefits for the web, a sense that the capabilities of variable fonts really haven't been leveraged yet. Everybody called out the slow adoption in desktop apps. And even on the web, we can't say that it's mainstream yet. Part of that is that there's little indication of adoption by graphic designers, especially for print, but also for the web. And a big theme that kept recurring and what people were saying was around communication and understanding of variable fonts and their potential benefits. A sense that the potential benefits have not yet been well communicated and understood by users. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about some of my own reflections on things that we said in 2016 that I don't think have been realized. We said that interpolation was already a familiar concept for type designers, but I don't think we appreciated, I think we underestimated some of the complexities that type designers would encounter, especially when you get into design spaces that have more than one axis. I think we didn't adequately anticipate some of the nuances of design spaces. It should have been somewhat obvious given well-known examples, things like Universe, that has a two-dimensional design space, but doesn't fully populate all of the corners. Eric van Blokland called this out at the time. For whatever reason, we didn't think it was something that we would really need to address immediately. But I think that it has been a significant issue in the past 5 years already. We suggested that hinting would get easier because in a variable font, there's just one set of outlines that need to be hinted. And so that could be more efficient. And yet, I think that was assuming a certain workflow for new designs, but not necessarily every scenario and workflow that was actually what type designers were doing. In particular, adaptation of existing families, where you've got multiple fonts that are already hinted and somehow needing to converge these into a single font. And finally, there was this whole issue of the potential. We called out there was lots of potential for better typography, and yet that's largely remained untapped. Automatic selection of optical size is one thing that we have seen in CSS. It's now also supported in InDesign. But beyond that, I think there's lots of potential benefits that aren't being realized, especially in desktop apps. So in addition to asking, okay, well, what has not yet been a success, I asked people about things that they expected and reality fell short of expectations, or maybe they were even really disappointed. And again, several things that people called out. People expected more from foundries like Monotype. They expected more conversions of existing families. There was more expectation of support in font services and overall usage in both web and print. Disappointment that we have not yet advanced the format further to address some improvements that might be needed. Now, when I asked this question, I wasn't anticipating that I would call out anybody in particular, but there was one theme that came up again and again from several people, and that was disappointment with Adobe in various respects. At the announcement in 2016, David Lemon said that they were preparing a number of new variable font releases in the near future, and yet we've only seen a small handful. And to put this into context, in 1999, Adobe had over 30 multiple master fonts. All of these were potential candidates for being adapted into OpenType variable fonts, and yet we've only seen 3 of those. People called out a sense in which, yes, there's support in 3 of their apps, but it feels like it's beta. For example, Illustrator, Photoshop, and InDesign have all got UI, and they've all got different UI for interacting with variable fonts. There was this sense that it feels like it's beta. Calling out the lack of support in the Adobe font service, and several people called out specifically, why is there not support for variable fonts in After Effects? Given the opportunity for motion typography, it seems like an obvious thing that After Effects should be supporting. So a lot of disappointment was expressed. And I think there's some of this that I definitely agree with. I'm surprised that we haven't seen more fonts from Adobe out of the collection that they have. It'd be great to see more of that. I'm kind of surprised that they don't have support in their font service, thinking that like they could be realizing some cost savings through more efficient seeking of font data. And After Effects seems like an obvious opportunity that's being missed. I will go to bat to them to some extent, though, with regard to the challenges of support in desktop apps. Now, some people may not agree with me on this, but I've seen challenges in Office. Definitely support in desktop apps is going to be needed for us to say that variable fonts are a complete success that we anticipated. But there are challenges that get called out. Some of it may be imaginary, but definitely some of it is real. So for the past 25 years, Office engineers have cited perf as an obstacle to providing better typography in apps like Word. In the same 25 years, Moore's Law has marched on. We've seen a lot, orders of magnitude increase in performance from hardware. So the claims that perf is a problem for better typography seems like it might be a dubious claim. But it's something that people have to decide to at least invest in to start testing to evaluate, is there any validity to that claim or not? And there are some other real challenges that developers for these large application suites face. I'm sure it's true of Creative Cloud. It's definitely true of Office, that it's got many different components built at different times using different technologies. And you can't simply say, oh, we're going to add support for variable fonts in this main context, because text ripples through many different endpoints in the application suites. And users expect there to be consistency in behavior across all of the scenarios that they're interested in. And so taking on significant support for variable fonts can translate into a significant investment in engineering that's needed. There's also issues around compatibility, because you've got large installed bases of older versions, and people will be taking documents from newer versions and expecting some kind of support in older versions. What are the right expectations there? That's something that needs to get figured out, as well as having billions of existing documents that need to continue to lay out exactly the same way as they did before. In the meantime, there's other business needs that the vendors are facing, where there are maybe clearer customer impacts, and those are competing for resources. So all that to say, I'm willing to cut a little slack and allow some more time for the likes of a Creative Cloud and Office to come up with better support for variable fonts. I continue to hold out hope that we will see some more in the future. Okay, getting back to perspectives that people were providing, I was asking them about problems that are being faced now. One of the things that was called out had to do with tool gaps. We need better support for converting existing families, better support for feature variations, and for GPAWs were specific things that got mentioned. Challenges for font development. One thing that several people commented was that developing variable fonts can still be pretty complex, especially when you get into design spaces with multiple axes. And several people called out that there are not, in fact, very many font developers now who have acquired all the skills needed to do it well. Rod Cheater mentioned this point that I thought was interesting. He had this perception, it seemed to him that good variable font development requires having an in-house software developer. If that's the case, then that's really a problem that needs to be solved before we can really move on towards success. And I've mentioned challenges for fonts that have design spaces with multiple axes. Part of the issue is managing the design space, as I talked about earlier, this issue that Eric von Blokland was calling out 5 years ago. A challenge where people are needing to, basically the format is sort of forcing people to add masters in all the corners of a rectilinear design space. And that means when you go to add one axis, well, adding axis is not a linear increase, it's a geometric increase. It's a geometric increase in the number of masters that need to be drawn, which is meaning significant increase in development costs. And there's a geometric increase in the amount of delta data that needs to be put into the font, adding to the font size. These are things that suggest that there are probably limitations in the font format that we need to resolve. There have been some ideas floating around for a few years. In particular, something that I think there's a lot of agreement on, that we need something like a version 2 of the AVAR table that will provide a lot more flexibility in how design spaces work and how variation changes across a design space. Another area where people felt there were problems had to do with CSS. One thing, just in asking why are we not seeing more use on variable fonts on the web, any change in coding practice creates some amount of resistance. People who know how have things that they're familiar with doing, they know how to do, and they've got projects that need quick results. And so taking time to figure out, well, how do I change this to a variable font? That needs some time to do that. One thing that was mentioned were some challenges around italic and slant. I think, and there's an issue here where CSS assumes that italic is a binary property, and yet that's not something that the OpenType spec imposes. And there are fonts that have use an italic axis for continuous variation. That may not always have been the most appropriate choice, but it is a reality. And so it means web developers rather are sometimes having challenges trying to get italic working when they try to implement it in CSS. There were some niggling inconsistencies between behavior in different browsers. And one particular issue was the behavior of the font variation settings property in terms of inheritance and cascading of the settings. That, in fact, things do not work the way that people would often like. And it effectively means that if you want, trying to use a custom axis from a variable font becomes particularly problematic in CSS. Roland Niskins has written a blog article describing this. So if you're curious, you can go and look at that afterward. There are some workarounds, but it's one more challenge that a web developer needs to figure out. How do they overcome these limitations? Back in 2016, as soon as we announced this, font vendors immediately started raising the question, what will this imply for pricing? And 5 years later, that's still something that vendors are still trying to figure out. One thing that's adding to the challenge is some misconceptions on the part of customers about how to value variable fonts. There's a way of thinking, which is to say, well, you can create a variable font from two different masters, and each of those masters is equivalent to a static weight. And so the price of a variable font should be about the same as the price for two weights of a family. Well, of course, that doesn't give much appreciation to the complexities involved and to the craftsmanship that's required. Now, some vendors may go to sort of an opposite extreme of saying, my variable font is functionally equivalent to and even greater than this large mega family of static fonts that I've got. And so it should be priced accordingly, equal or more than my entire mega family. That may not be the best strategy for font vendors. A different way of thinking might be instead to say, my average customers are willing to buy a certain amount. Maybe I can use variable fonts as an incentive to sell up. Maybe they'll be willing to pay some premium to get extra value. That may, in the end, translate into a lot more revenue. Mark Simonson was mentioned to me as one vendor who is taking that kind of approach with his variable fonts. Of course, all of this is tied to the challenges of how to communicate the value of variable fonts and the value proposition to customers. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a big theme that came out. This sense that there needs to be a lot more education of customers about what variable fonts are and what the benefits can be. But people aren't sure. How do we explain the benefits to customers? How should variable fonts be presented to users? Is there some kind of UI breakthrough that's needed to help people understand what they are and how to use them? But in talking to people, there was this sense started coming out that maybe these aren't the right questions. If it's proving to be difficult to communicate these things to end users and even to designers, maybe it's because we're not really appreciating, why is it a challenge? And I think part of the issue here is that we haven't yet adequately clarified what are different use cases for variable fonts and what are the value propositions in those different use cases. And I don't think we've adequately worked out what are the levels of understanding and typographic sophistication that should be needed at what points and by whom across the entire ecosystem. If it's hard to communicate, maybe that's because we're expecting the wrong levels of understanding from the different people. As I was talking about this with Greg Hitchcock, he mentioned some things in relation to OpenType Layout that I thought provided a useful analogy. So he talked about 3 different use cases for OpenType Layout. Originally, when they were designing OpenType Layout, they didn't have this 3-way distinction in mind, but it was something that kind of came to light afterwards. So language support is one particular use case for OpenType Layout, getting support for Arabic and Hindi and other languages that have complex scripts. And here, the functionality is something that is seamless, transparent to users. It just works, and that's really what it needs to be. It's something that had clear business value, and so was prioritized, and it proved to be something that was very successful in OpenType Layout. Now, a second use case with specialized typography, the use of things like historic ligatures. This is something that was always going to be niche, something that required user selection, and so user knowledge of the typography, and so some amount of specialization involved. But then there was this third use case, which was raising the bar in quality of typography broadly across users. Things like standard ligatures and kerning, where in most situations, all users could potentially benefit. And it's things that potentially could be made seamless for the average user, that they wouldn't need to actively understand and make choices to get that typography. In fact, in order for it to be broadly adopted, it's something that needs to be seamless, because the average users don't have the typographic expertise to be able to do that kind of typography. But when people would ask about business impact, the business questions, why should we add this functionality in our product? What is going to be the customer impact? It wasn't always obvious. And to some extent, I think there was an issue here of a tyranny of good enough. We're already way better than typewriters were. So do we really need to do much more? And it's been proven. There have been studies that shown that, yes, there are real benefits, but it's not always really obvious. For instance, it's not really obvious that if you improve typography, they will be able to do more creative problem solving in things that have nothing to do with typography, right? That's not an obvious connection. And so there have been these challenges to getting this kind of thing added into applications, along with these, claiming things like perf is going to be an obstacle to supporting. Okay, so these are the things that we talked about with Greg in regard to OpenType Layout, and I thought these provided a good analogy. So now I'll switch over to variable fonts in a conversation I was having with Dave Crossland, who makes a three-way distinction between use cases of compress, express, and finesse. I didn't talk enough with Dave for him to really flesh out exactly how he understands these three things. And so I may not be doing justice to the way he thinks about it. This is my spin on his three-way distinction. So compress, obviously we're talking about the size savings that can be beneficial for the web, for font services, operating systems. It can be something that where people see the benefits seamlessly. There's no things that they necessarily need to take steps. I think we've started to see some of that on the web. We've started to see these benefits in operating systems. The second category of expression, here I think of creativity. I think motion typography is an excellent example of this. And you can look at that and say, well, that's probably going to be for a niche market. And I think that there's definitely some truth to that, though I don't think that it's exclusively true. So on the one hand, you can imagine some really creative and sophisticated motion typography being used in professional media. That's stuff that will require a higher level of skill and expertise to do more sophisticated and creative things. But you can also imagine average users that don't have special skill having an interest in wanting to make use of more creative typography if it can be made accessible to them. I think there's a continuum there of things that might be, some things that can potentially benefit people that don't have any specialized skill, going on up to getting more and more benefits as people have more and more skill with what they can do. But at any of those levels, there's some amount of software sophistication that's needed to support them. If I go back to ColdType as an example, ColdType is a Python library. A graphic designer cannot create motion typography with ColdType unless they're also a software developer. It takes a software developer to do that. So we need applications that are providing some support for that expressive behavior, creativity. And then this whole area of finesse, going back to things that could be done with OpenType Layout, raising the bar in the quality of typography that is seen broadly across all categories of users. Things like use of optical size variants, grade, fitting of text, using minor width adjustments to fit text into columns. In order for this to be broadly available, it needs to be seamless, because average users don't have the typographic expertise to do that. And that means there needs to be software automation providing typographic intelligence. And so in those two areas of expressive and finessive use cases, there are software gaps, and we need to start filling those software gaps, I think, before the value proposition can be effectively communicated to customers, because we have to know what it is we're trying to present to them and show them what's going to be available to provide those solutions. Filling those software gaps is going to take people with engineering skills working in partnership with people that have typography expertise. And that's not something that that happens all the time today. There are not many software engineers who are, like Jason Palmental, also people that have a lot of typography expertise. So in summing up, in talking with people, there's the sense that yes, variable fonts have progressed towards success, but have not reached there yet. And I think we need more clarity around the use cases, and we need to start filling these gaps in software for creativity and providing typographic intelligence. I'll end with this thought that came out of my conversation with Dave Crossland. I think maybe variable fonts are exposing a need for a transition. We've been, for many years, offering fonts to people effectively as building blocks for them to do whatever typography. And maybe we need to transition to offering more valuable, offering typography. So with that, I will end, and we can open up for some discussion.
Do not have a lot of time, but I'm sure that we can take some of the questions that the audience have asked.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a great summary. It was so good. I don't have any immediate things I need to ask you. So, but there are some questions.
There are some questions in the chat. I'll start with the ones that were people followed the rules and put them in under the question mark. And you may have already covered these, but we'll ask them anyway. John Berry asks, do we have enough text spaces as variable fonts? That to me is the most important part, despite the appeal of display pyrotechnics.
Well, I think there are a number of text spaces. An interesting question is whether we're seeing enough good quality text spaces and text spaces that are providing some key benefits. But of course, that also has to go, as I mentioned, with software that can take advantage of some capabilities. So I think we're seeing lots of text spaces that add a weight axis. Well, that's great. It might be more interesting if we saw more text spaces that also have a width axis that could be used for fine adjustment in things like justification, but going along with software algorithms that can leverage a weight axis to do fine adjustments in fitting text, right? So I think there's a combination of things there.
Yeah, John followed up with automatic selection of optical sizes. That would be extremely useful in Microsoft Office among naive users. So I think that ties in exactly with that that point.
Yeah. Other questions?
Looking through. Lots of good comments. You'll have to go back and read the chat. Seeing if I can find an actual question. So who was it who has said all these bad things about Adobe? I want names. I want names of the people who said these bad things.
Not naming names, other than the folks at Adobe called out the lack of support in their font service.
Okay. So there was some kind of corrections.
Okay.
Tom Finney wrote, Font Lab supported multiple master fonts decently in the mid-90s, and Fontographer did kind of although it was pretty hacky.
Okay.
Um,
Tom, you could have told me that 5 years ago.
Tom also made the comment that open source variable fonts alone outnumber all multiple master and GX variations fonts ever released combined.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Lots of Tom Finney quotes. Let's see if I can find somebody else. Okay, Steve Madison wrote, simply not enough customers see a benefit, or they see a simple family of fonts a more efficient brand solution, just as the number of customers who appreciate or are aware of OpenType features is still very low.
Right, and I try to address some that maybe we're setting expectations of people in the wrong way, and maybe there's more that we collectively as industry need to be doing in terms of software, adding more sophistication into software, and then in terms of what font vendors are trying to deliver to customers in concert with the software, not just fonts as building blocks, but typographic solutions that are within reach of those customers at whatever level of sophistication they've got.
Are you seeing any companies making that push in that direction, or making anything interesting or significant there?
I don't have any particular visibility into that. I can only say this was one idea that Dave Crosland said he thought that needed to be explored more. So I don't know if they're thinking that Google Fonts could be doing more in that way.
I was thinking maybe the Typatura project of Scott Kellum could have been mentioned, Peter. That's an interesting delivery of typography that certainly uses variable fonts in a nice way.
Yeah, I'm not particularly familiar with that. Yesterday, Jason Hamantal gave a talk about work that he's done with the state of Rhode Island, creating their CMS system, setting up a system to deliver good typography across state websites, state agency websites, where the functionality was built into the system that they were developing, not something that the content developers would need to repeat over and over again. I think we need to see more of that kind of thing repeated.
I think one of the disappointing. Sorry, go ahead, Christina.
Go ahead. I was just watching the question box, and John Barry's pointing out that when we're speaking of type users, it's good to be more specific of if we're talking about office users or graphic designers or even corporate clients or students, things like that. And yeah, and kind of following with that, Steve Madison's pointing out that corporate clients are declining variable fonts when they're offered and don't really see the interest.
I think one thing that strikes me is that this is a big change in how people have used how people use type, and it does need the support of advertisers and people who are good at professional and good at promotion of these things. And I think that's
what you promote it to.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I think people are disappointed with Adobe. I guess there's no point for them doing a big push until it's ready on all their platforms, as well as After Effects. And my fonts are monotype. If you type variable fonts into these platforms, you get nothing. You get a font that's called variable, which is really, really useless.
Marketing opportunity.
Yeah, that's great marketing right there.
For
that one person.
For one person, yeah. But we mustn't let the independents off the hook. Type Network, Font Stand, the otherwise fantastic I Love Typography site. You can't find good variable font information on these sites easily. I want to type in variable fonts into their search engine, or certainly have an article featuring variable fonts surfaced reasonably highly.
But
So if these people are not,
that's kind of what they're saying though, is that it's like it's a big chain of user and type designer and customer and whatever else, and like especially for an independent, like investing so much when you're dependent on this whole system that's not supporting it is a lot to do for
and it's a lot to ask of the independents. It's a lot to ask that the independent sector
So
should promote this without the backing of Monotype, for example.
Yeah, and I obviously thank Peter for the research here and going out and talking to everybody and this landscape, which I think is coming from the software company viewpoint. Maybe for the next ATypI, we can ask him to go and talk to type designers and get their views on where this is going. The independents who we have been talking about. And
well, I did talk to some type designers.
Yeah.
I talked to, John Hudson, Aaron Bell, DJR. Thinking who else did I talk to?
Yeah. But I think maybe like more of a, and I'm kidding when we're going to ask you to do this, but a survey of a broad spectrum of independents where they see variable fonts going, and Steve Madison's comments about that the corporate customers he works with are not interested. I wonder if independent type designers are making those variable fonts for those clients in the background so they can sell them later, because it would seem as if that may be an approach. Do the work up front, and then because I think the corporates are going to want it eventually.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might also be worth asking Dave Crossland formally to release his slogan, which I think is fantastic. That compress, express, finesse triple. It's brilliant. I think we should.
Are we going to get a little jingle with it as well?
Yeah, why not?
He may be doing some merch, some T-shirts and designs, and he's kept it under wraps. But
well, he might want to keep it for Google. I don't know, but I doubt it. I think he'd appreciate it if it was more widely used. But that kind of imagination and sloganizing and advertising professionalism, I think, is sadly lacking in people whose support we would normally expect to be leading on this.
John Barry has another comment, and it feels like the meme of Spider-Man all pointing to each other. But he's saying that it seems like the problem isn't type designers creating variable fonts, but the people who create typography, whether professional or amateur, seeing the results. So it really does feel like in here we have the such a chain of so many different players that all need to come together to make it happen, and constant well, if they're not seeing the benefit, why am I gonna?
Yeah, we have to work together, and it has to include, the software engineers as well, being willing to get into the game.
So Tobias from Google Fonts has said, I can speak for Dave when I say the slogan is for everyone to use. So I think we are, it's now official. So could you repeat the slogan, Lawrence, so we have it for the record?
Compress, express, finesse.
Beautiful. There you go. That's Beautiful. All variable fonts have been missing. All right. Well, Tobias, expecting a jingle from you.
Oh dear, I hadn't. I'm afraid I can't compose as quickly as that. Maybe I should watch more of the Beatles documentary to help me.
Are there any other questions or thoughts from our lovely audience? Or are we just going to stay on the slogan part for the next 5 minutes?
Well, we could let people move over to the Hangout room. The next talk will start in 5 minutes. So
it'll be a good time.
Unless anyone has any more comments about Adobe. No, just kidding. And from my perspective of being a font guy at Microsoft and working in Office, I totally agree. We need to do more work. We are, I would say, equally or more to blame than Adobe for slow adoption in apps, and we need to do better.
One little thing I meant to ask you, Peter, is there anything coming in 1.9, OpenType 1.9, which is coming very soon? Is there anything variable in that?
Yeah, I would have actually pulled the trigger on 1.9 this week, except I was still preparing for this talk. So an extension to the color table that will add significant new capabilities for vector color fonts that don't involve the use of SVG and that integrate very well with variable fonts.
All right. Well, then
That's
I guess
great.
we have to find a slogan for that.
Yep, and a jingle. Thank you
right.
so much, Peter.
Everyone with jingle thoughts, over to the hangout room. We'll talk in a
Okay.
minute.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thank you so much.